And we are here. Look at that. You called it. I was gonna mess it up.
I knew it. I told you.
Let's go, man.
Oh, pretty good. Pretty good.
You look a little bit glistening, like you're still feeling
I'm a
the
little
day.
bit sweaty. If I stood up, you would see the wound on my shirt.
You got a little cleave stain. Got a little cleavage stain.
Yeah, it's hot out there.
It is
Really, really
it's
hot.
really hot. What you say your feels like was yesterday?
Like today it was like 115.
Oh yeah,
Um,
it's
Yesterday I think was 108 or 109 time I looked.
yeah.
But it 85, 86 degrees at 5 a.m. So there's really no relief.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're gonna have a good show tonight. We have a guest tonight. His name is William Jevning, and he worked alongside some of the originals. That started this ball rolling. Grover Krantz, Peter Byrne, Renee DeHenden, and John Green. He worked with Renee DeHenden and met him about 50 years ago. So he's got probably a lot of interesting things that he could talk about. Dealing with the four horsemen, so to speak, with
Right.
Bigfoot researching.
Yeah.
Like that's pretty much the foundation of all of this. So we're gonna bring him on, and we're gonna pick his ear, let him tell us about some of his encounters and things he's seen and heard along the way. And this is going to be a really good show because I think we could probably learn something from him. So with that, we're going to go ahead and bring William on. William, how you doing, bud?
I'm good. How are you guys doing?
Doing fantastic. Let me get everybody switched. There you go. Got everybody switched around. So how you been?
Busy. I'm always busy.
Well, you know what? Thanks for taking the time for coming and hanging out with us for a little bit.
Absolutely.
So you go way back. Before you met up with Renee DeHenden, what got you interested in this?
Well, when I was a kid, I never heard of this before. And, I grew up about 40 miles northwest of Mount Rainier in Washington State. And, in a very rural area. We had a small farm in an area where there were lots of small farms. And, I grew up hunting and fishing and being out in the woods all the time. Very comfortable with that. And what got our attention to begin with was one day in December of 1972, when I was 14, a friend that came over to spend the weekend. And it snowed, so we were kind of bored because there wasn't much to do at my place. So we thought, well, let's go over to our friend John's, who lived about a half a mile away, and maybe the three of us can figure out something to do. So we had a trail that went through the forest, but because snow was on the ground, we couldn't find the trail. So we decided to walk down the road and hit the railroad tracks. And then the tracks ran in front of John's house. So that's what we did. And we got almost all the way to John's house when we saw something lying between the rails ahead of us. And the snow covered everything except the rails. They were bare. So we walked up to this, and it was a pile of animal intestines that were lying between the rails, and which, wasn't totally unusual being out in the woods, but we couldn't see any kind of footprints in the snow, none. So we're trying to figure out how this got to this location. We could see off to the right, and it was kind of an open field. There was nothing in the snow there, nothing the way we came. So I told my buddy Mark, I said, you walk down the tracks and see if you can see anything, and I'll climb the embankment over here to the left. There was a hill on the left, and I climbed up about 8 or 10 feet, and they had cut a fire access road with a bulldozer in the previous summer. So there was kind of a flat area that went along the tracks, and the area up there was chewed up with these big human, like bare footprints. So I hollered at him. I said, hey, come and look at this. And we're kind of oohing and ahhing, trying to figure out what in the world, number one, who had a foot that big, and what are they doing out here in, minus 20 degree weather in the snow, barefooted. And then it dawned on me that the intestines weren't frozen. Like I said, it was minus 20 degrees. And that scared us because whatever had placed them there, and this place was right above where the intestines were. So, in my thinking, they came from this place. And it scared us, so we took off running to John's house. So we were out there pounding in the door furiously. And my buddy John he had two younger sisters and two younger brothers. So here's the living room full of these kids that were just, in total pandemonium. And John's dad was a retired Navy guy, so he come out and he's kind of gruff, and he's like, boys, settle down. What's going on? And so we told him. So he grabbed a .45 pistol and a camera, and he says, take me back there and show me what you found. So we did. This whole gaggle of kids went up there, and I'm pretty sure John and I were talking about it recently. We're pretty sure that, all of us kids probably wiped out most of the footprints meandering around and stuff there. But his dad did take some pictures, and he proceeds to tell us what probably made him. And of course, 14-year-old boys, we were big into, the old Universal monster movies and stuff like that. So we're like, wow, there's real monsters out here in the woods. So we take our 22s every weekend after that for a couple of months and go looking in the woods. Never saw anything. So when you're that age, if something doesn't continue, you forget about it pretty quickly and you move on to something else. Well, fast forward 2 years to the fall of 1974. And my dog is going crazy. We had to tie my dog up. I had a collie. We had to tie him up at night because he liked to roam the neighborhood farms, and my parents didn't want him getting into trouble, chasing somebody's animals or whatever. So we tied him up in the evening for the night in his doghouse. So he was barking like crazy. My dad always said, if anything comes in the yard, and we always had skunks and raccoons and you name it, would come in the yard. Elk would even come down and eat with the cattle sometimes. So I grabbed a 22 and a couple of bullets, and I went out and got him. I said, all right, go get him. And he goes tearing out by this tree line that was near our barn. And he got to the edge of the tree line and he froze. And he was standing with his ears up and his tail up. And I'm thinking, what the heck? That dog, he never stopped for anything. He got in a porcupine twice in his life because he was too dumb to not attack anything. So he turned around as I approached him and ran past me at top speed. And I thought, what the heck is that dog doing? I've never seen him run from anything. So I thought, well, and this was after the first porcupine incident. We had a mouthful of quills. I thought, well, maybe he learned his lesson for once. And I chambered around and I walked up to the tree line where he was standing, and I could hear something moving inside the tree line. So I thought, okay, there's something in there. And the grass was pretty tall. It was probably, between 3 and 4 feet high. And these fir boughs hung down into it from the trees that lined the edge of it. So I had to have the rifle in one hand, and I pushed my way through with the other. And then on the inside of that initial opening there was a big maple tree in there. When that thing was the trunk was probably 3-4 feet across easily. It was a big one. And this would have been October. I'm pretty sure it was October because we were getting frost at night, and that was about hunting season. So, and all the leaves were on the ground. So as I came into that clearing under the tree, I see this massive thing standing to my left side of the trunk, and it was moving leaves around with its right foot. And when it saw me, it stopped and just stood there and looked at me. And it was, like I said, I was 16 at the time, so I was probably about 5'9", 5'10", and this thing was a good 2 feet higher than I was tall, and 4 to 5 feet across the shoulders. It was massive, and it was just solid all the way down. And I was just stunned. I thought, all this stuff goes through your mind so quickly. I'm trying to figure out. Like I said, when I was 9 years old, I got within 5 feet of a black bear, and after honey hives instead of kids. So,
Thank God.
But I was around animals. I knew wildlife, and I thought I knew everything in the forest. But I saw this thing, and it just totally kind of short-circuited my thinking. So I thought, your first thing you think is, how am I going to get out of this situation? So I thought, maybe if I shoot in the air, it'll scare it off. And again, all this happens so quickly. I always react to a situation thinking rather than just emotionally. So my brain's going, okay, you need to do something to get out of this. So I shot in the air, didn't do anything. It just stood there and stared at me. And then off to my right rear, I hear some noise in the brush. And I'm trying to keep an eye on this thing and glance it over at the same time. Well, I see this other one come walking out of the brush, and it walked over and stood by the first one. And it was probably, I'd say, about a head shorter, a little bit lighter build. But that's all it took for me to bolt from the tree line and run the way the dog did, hoping they weren't going to come breathing down my neck. Now, my sisters, after we found the footprints in 72, they raked Mark and I over the coals. They thought that was just the craziest, funniest thing they ever heard. So when this happened, I didn't say a thing. I got on the phone in the kitchen. I called John and told him quietly what happened. So he called another friend of ours, and along with his two brothers, we all took our hunting rifles up before first light the next morning. And we followed these two sets of tracks in the frost until, I don't know, we must have followed them till 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. When the sun came out and melted the frost, we lost the trail. I don't know what we thought we were going to do if we had caught up with them. But that's what we did. And then we didn't talk about it. So my buddy John and I don't recall if we were playing basketball or baseball in intramural sports after school, but we were riding the activities bus home one evening, and where we lived in that rural area, there weren't very many kids that stayed after school to do anything. So there was maybe 6 or 7 kids on this bus. So everybody was spread way out, and John and I were kind of sitting towards the back, and he was sitting in the seat behind me, but I was turned around. We were talking very quietly about this situation that happened. And it would have been in the spring of 1975. So, a few months after the incident happened. And another one of our friends, I swear he had bat ears because he overheard us talking way in the back. And he come over and he sit down next to John. And he says, "Can I interview you about what happened?" And I thought to myself, I knew this guy Jim pretty well. He was a friend too. And I knew he didn't have many friends and wouldn't talk to anybody. So I thought, oh, okay, I'll tell him. So I told him, and he made some notes, and I never heard anything more about it. He came a couple of weeks later and gave me these 3 books that were written by a man named John Green out of Canada. And I was amazed there was so much stuff written about these creatures. So I poured over those books. And then in the summer, and this would have been, I was, for some reason, it must have been growing pains or something, sleeping, being out, doing something. I was always outside doing something. So I was sleeping in my room, and one of my sisters came and knocked on my door, and she said, "Hey, there's 2 men here to see you." And I woke up and I'm thinking, 2 men? I don't know any men. Maybe except my dad's uncles or dad's brothers and his friends. But other than that, I didn't, I was 17 years old. I didn't know any men. So I slipped on my barn boots, and the way our house was situated, nobody ever used the front door. The driveway came around to the back door. So I walked out there, and there were 2 men. The first one I recognized from John Green's books. It was Rene Hendon. And, in the 70s, if you saw somebody in a book, that it was automatically that person was famous. So I wasn't really starstruck, but I was amazed to see this guy that I'd been reading about in these books. And the other guys was a man named Dennis Gates, and he was from Northern Washington, another Bigfoot investigator. Back in those days, they didn't call themselves investigators or researchers. They were Sasquatch hunters. That's what the term was back then. In fact, I still consider myself that. I don't, I'll put it out there saying I'm a researcher or whatever, but really that's what we were. So he asked me about the things that I had seen and everything. And what he was done, he says, "Well, we got a camp about 7 miles north of here. John Green's there, and there's some other people. Maybe you can come up and meet these guys." So I said, sure. And they left, and I called a friend of mine that had a car because I didn't have one. And we went out there, and it was interesting. I don't know if you guys are aware, there was a big rift between John Green and Rene Hendon after they'd worked together for quite a number of years. And it was over Green using Rene's pictures for his books without ever giving Rene credit or paying him for the use of those pictures. So they had a big, kind of a permanent rift over that, but they shared that camp. And I spent most of my time with the Hendon the few days we were there because Green sat in his travel trailer the whole time and talked to the locals that would come there. But Hinton was out walking the roads at night, and I stayed with him, being very quiet, watching and listening, and talked to Green and a state trooper that was there that had seen the same creatures I had, and when they left, they said, "Well, DeHinden says you're pretty good in the field. Stay in touch. You can like you to be our eyes and ears in this area." So I did, and everything sort of kept going from there.
That's a really good introduction, man. Just getting started. Dang.
Yeah, good show.
So the two that you've seen, were they companions? Were they?
There was actually 3 in that group. The state trooper Mark Pittenger, he saw all 3 of them. I don't know where the third one was in that area, because when he and I compared notes, and he was a really cool guy. I mean, for an adult state trooper. And here I am, a 17-year-old kid, he talked to me like an adult. He was very, he was a great guy. He caught a lot of flack for saying that he'd seen these things.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
But he didn't care. He knew what he saw. But, let's see, back to your original question. What was your original question? I lost my train of thought there. I got off on a tangent.
Oh no, you're fine. What do you think they were? A traveling family, a unit, just a squad?
No, they were a group. They were a group. I don't know. In the third one, I don't know if they were male, female, or what. I mean, the 2 that I saw were probably males. Just because of I was majoring in anthropology years later in college after I got out of the Army, so I knew a little bit about how you can identify with primates if something's male or female based on where their body mass is. If it's higher, it's a male. If it's lower, it's usually female.
Yeah, for me, I just got to look at their butt. If it's blown out, it's a girl. If it's not,
there you go.
That's the only way I know, just by looking. Did they have any aggression? I mean, did they act like they knew you guys were there?
I'm sure they did. I think, thinking about it years later, and I've thought about it on and off for all this time, that, our barn was right there. We raised pigs. There were pigs in there. All the feed for the animals was in there. Cows would come up to there. I think they were probably there looking for an easy meal. And it just happened to be that, me and the dog went out there and caught them. And I'm sure they left right after that encounter. They probably took off as soon as I did.
Gotcha. You got anything about that, Bob?
No, it's just a very, very interesting story.
Yeah.
And that area's had so much activity. Even all these years later, people kind of grudgingly have come forward, and I've interviewed thousands of people over the years. In fact, on my podcast alone, I've got probably, I think I have close to 1,200 interviews on there now. But people are still coming forward, talking about things they've seen. In fact, kind of going back to, my younger sisters making so much fun of me. Now, that was in 1974. So fast forward to 1981. The one who was the main protagonist, and I won't mention her name because she'll chop me off at the knees, but she had her own very close encounter with one not far from where our house was, where we grew up. She went to another sister's house one night. She was going to spend the night, and that would have driven right by the house we grew up in. But for whatever reason, she decided to go home later that night. And in the area where she came down, had to go take a left at one intersection, and that's the only place there was a street light, coincidentally. So she was getting ready to make the left turn, and here was this thing standing on the shoulder right next to the road under the light, and it was jumping up and down like it was very agitated, and it scared her so bad. I was at their house visiting for Thanksgiving, I think it was. This is probably 20 years ago. And my brother-in-law left the room, and we've all, my brother-in-law, I've been good friends since right after school. So he left the room, and she says, I have something I have to tell you. So she tells me this, and had never told anyone, not even him. And even to this day, she won't talk about it. She wouldn't write the thing down. She just wanted nothing to do with it. But it was, you can tell if my brother-in-law, he'll occasionally bring it up now, and she's visibly shaken by the experience. And I could have went, ha, I told you,
Yeah.
but I was, trying to be very understanding and supportive, because for some people it's an extremely traumatic experience. And for her, it was.
Yeah. What is your podcast called?
It's called Creek Devil.
Is it just like it sounds?
Just like it sounds.
I will put it in there.
So I assume at that
Is it on
point
YouTube?
your sister.
It's on YouTube.
Okay.
I
What's
assume
that?
at that point your sister quit giving you crap.
Oh yeah. Yep. Whole different change of
And
attitude.
did she
Let me tell you.
apologize?
Well, she didn't, but they tend to forget things they do when they're kids,
Yeah. Yeah.
Conveniently.
Yeah. That's. And do you still live in that same area?
I just moved back from New Mexico, so I'm pretty close to there now. In fact, I just put out some feelers on a few community pages, and normally if you put out, you're looking for stories or whatever, you kind of get the cold shoulder for most people.
Mm-hmm.
I was amazed how many people came forward from the community pages, and one person even sent a video from, I want to say 3 years ago, where they were camping, and it's in an area that's very active. In fact, in my cast collection, it's the smallest cast I have of a baby Bigfoot. It's only 3 inches long, and it's from that very place. And what's on the video, you can't really, not much of a video. I think it's her phone. It's sort of pointing down with a dim light, but the screaming that was going on is really dramatic. So, I'm going to nose around here and see what I can dig up from my old home area. I've got a friend that works in Hollywood that I've done the podcast for 14 or 15 years. So I'm going to continue doing it for a few more years, but we're sort of moving into, we went to the Three Sisters Wilderness in Oregon 2 years ago. And for me, it was a chance to work with new team members, my field team, and new equipment. So that was my focus, was kind of trying out new things and new people. And Adam filmed everything while we were there. So he decided to throw it together as a documentary, and that's been out now for a while. The second one is almost completed, and it's very, very different than the first, because like I said, the first one wasn't intended to be a documentary, but this one was. And we spent 11 days on the Navajo reservation in October. And I said, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we create a TV series instead of another documentary? We have all kinds of ideas for documentaries. So he took all the footage we got there and made a 10-part TV series. And I don't know exactly when it's going to be released. I think he's almost completed with it. I know he was tweaking the last episode, but we found a lot of stuff on the Navajo reservation. In fact, one of the things that floored me the most, we stayed in the capital of the Navajo reservation. That's called a little place called Window Rock. And everybody was super nice there. Almost every single person we talked to in the reservation had seen one of these things at least once. One night, we talked about different things we wanted to collect in terms of field or evidence there. And I said, well, it'd be nice to get some good screams, because in the town of Gallup, we were about 30 miles from Gallup, where they do the, I can't think, the polling, Gallup, New Mexico. And they said there was something called the Gallup Screamer that was happening at that time, but we didn't want to drive 30 miles, which is funny because our friend Don, who's a Navajo and invited us there, he got a text, and way up north near Flagstaff, Arizona, with a 2-hour drive. There was screaming going on this one night, this person said. So we loaded up and drove 2 hours to that place instead of going to Gallup. And we waited around about an hour, didn't hear anything. So we had a pretty full agenda the next day and an early start. So I said, well, why don't we go back, get some rest, and we'll get up early in the morning and hit it again. So we drove 2 hours back. Now we got 5 hours invested in going someplace to get screaming. We get back to the hotel we were staying at. Now across the highway, there was this long mesa. And I looked at my watch. We had been back to the hotel 8 minutes exactly. And I get a text from Adam downstairs. He says, come outside now. And I walk towards my door and I hear this howling coming through the wall. It was that loud. And I opened the door and they were both, Don and Adam were standing downstairs grinning. And this thing was just raising bloody hell, screaming across the highway. And the local Indians there said, oh, that happens every 2 or 3 days. They'll go out and honk their horns and rev their engines trying to get it to shut up. It'll scream, and it screamed for an hour. We recorded a lot of it. And it's in the first episode of the TV show. Adam sent me a couple of the episodes so I could get an idea what he was putting together. And I don't know if you know who Thinker Thunker is on YouTube. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, Adam sent him 60 seconds out of the hour's worth of this stuff we got. And he compared it. He did a comparison with what's in that area. There's Mexican gray wolves in that area. So he compared it to other wolves, Mexican gray wolves, and it's nothing like those howls. It's something very unique. And so we got permission from him to use that for the TV episode. But I already knew because I've heard these things so many times over all the years I've done this. I said, guys, that's what we came here for, to get stuff like that recorded. And sure enough, we did. So lots of stuff happened up there. We interviewed one family one night. The Navajo, a lot of them will have their traditional regular house near the towns, and then they have kind of homesteads out in remote areas. And a lot of them will have their hogan where they stay in and do ceremonies and things like that. So we filmed the family in the hogan. And thankfully so, it was really cold outside. And they had a nice roaring fire going in the stove in there. So we went outside, and the gentleman who was the man of the family, he went out and they told us there was a place above us called Twin Buttes. And we had tried getting up there in the daytime, and my Jeep will go most places, but I couldn't get it up there because the ruts were, 4+ feet deep, and you just couldn't. You could almost not walk up there. It was so rough. So he went outside and did the only thing I guess you could describe it as like a war cry, a couple of war cries up towards Twin Buttes. And within 30 seconds, 60 seconds, these things started whistling back down at us. And we have all that recorded too. It sounds just like a man whistling. I'd heard it before on the Olympic Peninsula here in Washington, but I wasn't really familiar with marmots. And the local up there was saying, oh, that's marmots whistling, because it sounded just like a man whistling. Put your fingers in your mouth and whistle loud. Well, marmots don't make any sounds like that. But the Indians all say that they whistle. When you see the ceremonial masks from the Northwest, predominantly, you see the ones with the pursed lips.
Yeah.
That's what they're representing are these creatures whistling.
Yeah. So it sounds like you've got some information that I'd like to find out. How do you go about getting access to the reservations? You got some reservations down here in Florida.
I have friends. I have friends everywhere.
We got a lot of reservations down here in Florida I'd like to get access to. Would I even know how to go about even trying?
Well, now I had people contact me, and in fact, I had a friend on the Klamath Reservation in Southern Oregon, and I just meet a lot of people. A lot of times they'll contact me. I have a guy who's an Apache. He contacted me and sent me photos of footprints right outside of his house and about a foot of snow, and he was pretty upset that they were that close to his house. Don, our Navajo friend, he reached out to me, and I knew a guy on the Flathead Reservation who's unfortunately passed on now, but um, lots of information from those folks. Sometimes it's just a matter of uh, contacting someone and saying, "Hey, I'm so and so. I'd like to learn from you folks, or maybe come out and chat or something like that."
Yeah. Got any questions, Bob?
It's not too hard, really. It's just a matter of reaching out, say, "Hey, this is who I am, and this is what I do. And would you mind talking to me?"
Yeah, questions are hard with him because he tells such a good, thorough story.
Yeah, your answers.
He doesn't leave any questions there.
Yeah.
So it's tough. Good storytelling.
Yeah. Well, you had mentioned that you have interviewed over 1,200 people.
Oh, that's just for the show. I've talked to thousands of people over
Right.
the years.
Now, in your area where you were at, have you ever had interviewed people and it turns out that something unique about this Sasquatch that was seen by another person, and people had seen the same being?
When I lived in Vancouver, which is just north of Portland, down by the Columbia River, for about 12 years. And I was going through my divorce back in the mid 80s and getting out of the Army. And a friend of mine who lived down there, I called him and was kind of, crying in his shoulder a few times because, if you've ever been married or been with somebody that's an alcoholic and then, the Army makes tons of demands, you sort of get pulled in all kinds of directions. And he said, "Look, when you get out of the Army, come down here and stay a while. I've got a big place, and 3-story house, you can stay down here as long as you want, clear your head. And if you like it here, stay." So I loved Vancouver back in the mid 80s. It was a small town. And, I met a gal there and we ended up living together. And she, one night she says, "Well, it's so nice, that you spend so much time with me and the kids, but isn't there something you'd like to do for yourself?" And I thought to myself, if I tell her, she's going to think I'm nuts. But I wanted to be honest with her. So I told her. Yeah. And she says, "No, that's really interesting. You should get back into this." So, we ended up, her son and his friend, I made up a bunch of flyers, looking for information. They wrote out.
I think maybe something's happened to your audio, William. We lost you. Oh, you're muted. I see your microphone's muted. Okay, go ahead and see if I can unmute it. Yeah, it looks like it's on his end.
Yeah, it says that your mic isn't.
Now you're good.
I don't know how that happened, but I'm not touching anything. But anyhow, the kids rode on their bikes, put these flyers on cars, and it's funny how things happen. Sometimes it's just one thing that'll cascade into a whole bunch of events. So with this situation, they put it on a deputy sheriff's car by the courthouse, and one of the next towns over, the editor of the newspaper there was walking up to the courthouse, and the deputy says, "Here, you might like this." I was just going to throw it away. So the guy contacts me, and I really hadn't done much in the subject. I spent 10 years in the Army, and I was away most of the time. So I did a little bit when I had a chance when I was in the service, but that was very limited. So I didn't have a ton of experience as an investigator of any kind. But this guy contacted me, and he wanted to do an interview. So he did a big 2-page spread on me. And he put in my contact information, and his photographer took me out. He was from a local community there, and took me out, showed me where all the things that the locals had seen were. So I started working in an area called the Washougal River, and that's where eventually I had my second sighting, was up there. But going up there, we found tracks in the snow a couple of times, and I wanted to go up one of these times to look for tracks. We took the kids up to play in the snow, and there was another family near where we were parked. And I had my camera hanging around my neck, and the guy walks over and he says, "Are you getting any good pictures?" And I just grinned and I said, "I hope so." No, he didn't know what I meant. But then we got talking, and I told him what I was doing, and he kind of leans over quietly and he says, "You know, me and my buddies were up here 17 years ago." Well, this was after my second sighting, because I saw this big gray Sasquatch by the river on the other side, and me and everybody in the car except my girlfriend saw it. And I described what I saw, and he says, "You know, we all saw the same one 17 years ago. We were up here elk hunting, and we're all standing around the fire one night." And he was talking about like 6, 7 guys in the group. And this thing come walking out. It was at night, right to the edge of the firelight, and stood there and just stared at him for a bit. Then it turned around and walked off. So that's one of the times that I had someone I talked to that confirmed exactly what it was that we saw.
That's cool.
It does happen occasionally.
Yeah.
There are places where there are big events. I wrote one of my books is called Haunted Valley, and it's about a little town north of Vancouver called Yacolt. And Yacolt is the Indian term, and it means haunted valley. That's why I named it that. And a long, long history of things there. Lots of people saw them. I took my own field team up there many times while we were conducting a 9-month investigation there. And people on my team who were very skeptical ended up seeing the creatures. So I think everybody actually saw one there except me. I saw eye shine on a couple of occasions, but close up, but didn't actually, lay eyes on the creatures. I mean, that's the situation. There was a lot of crazy things that happened there.
Do you have any stories from law enforcement, government officials, or rangers or anything like that? Things that would give us, we know down here that FWC is managing these down here.
Sure.
We know, because when we've had encounters from our documentaries that we did, a week later, going back every place that we had activity, they did control burns in those exact spots.
Somebody contacted me from Florida, and I'm trying to remember who it is offhand, but it might have been somebody from the wildlife there. And apparently what their information was that everybody in the Florida Wildlife Organization, they all listen to my podcast.
Nice.
I was trying to actually get a hold of anybody who would talk there, but I haven't yet. But I didn't really pursue it hard either, because I'm busy so many other places. But as far as being a veteran, I get a lot of people that are vets that contact me because military veterans will more likely talk to another veteran than they will anybody else, just because
brotherhood.
We kind of share all the BS that we went through together.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you a story. I've got a good friend who's a police chief in Texas. And when he was still living in southern New Mexico before he moved back to Texas, he was working as a cop just across the border in Texas, but he was living in a town called Las Cruces. And he was friends with, of course, the local PD and some of the deputy sheriffs there. So he told me a story about this 15-year-old boy who was out at a friend's house, and he rode his bike home. Now, that part of New Mexico is very green because it's near the Rio Grande River, and that's where a lot of big pecan orchards, huge ones there. So lots of cover, lots of food, there's water, great country for these things. So this kid was out near that area, and he realized he was at the friend's house too late, and he had to ride his bike home in the dark. And Las Cruces doesn't put too many street lights out. Well, number one, because the skies are so clear, the locals like it dark to see the sky at night. And almost 365 days a year, you get a nice, beautiful view of the sky at night. So what they do is they'll put up street lights where there are danger points like curves and things like that for traffic. And out in this area, there's not much traffic anyhow. But anyhow, This kid was riding home, and he had the feeling he was being followed. So he stopped under this first streetlight he came to, and he put his feet down. He turned around and looks, and here's this massive thing behind him on all fours, and it was at 6 feet high on all fours.
Yikes.
So he went to take off on his bike, and it reached out and grabbed his bike. The kid goes flying off the handlebars in the front, and he gets up and he takes off running. So he gets home in a panic, and his parents, of course, they didn't believe him, and he says, call the police. I'll tell you. So they did. They called the sheriff's department. Deputy came out. Well, the deputy was a good friend of my buddy's, and he thinks the kid's making this up too. So the kid says, "No, BS. I'll take you out there and show you." So the deputy took him up on it. He took him out there. They found the kid's bike. The frame was bent, and it was thrown 15 feet up into a pecan tree. And so my buddy, he decides with him and the deputy, they get in the deputy's cruiser and they go out there one night. And now it's funny. I was living in California at the time, and I'm sitting on my bed watching TV, and he's texting me what they're doing, minute by minute. So I'm kind of advising him, and they shine the light from the cruiser off into this pecan orchard at one point on one side of the road, and they saw 9 sets of eyes. And then within moments, now this is the cruiser's parked. 5 feet behind the cruiser, this thing roared. It was probably the Alpha, roared. And it was so loud and frightening. The deputy wet himself. And I'm telling the guys, number one, you need to get the hell out of there. I said, take the poor deputy, get him changed. You guys go someplace and have a cup of coffee and calm down. So, and there's more to that story. The deputy, when he collected the bicycle, there was some blood on part of the bike. So him being on duty, now we have a full chain of custody situation here. So he collected the blood sample, and they said they have what they call the $20 test. It's where they run it through the crime lab, and it just, I guess, goes into CODIS or whatever system they're using to see if anybody is on their radar from that blood sample. Well, they didn't hear anything for about a year. And then one day the deputy gets called in by the sheriff himself to his office, which is usually not a good thing. So he goes in there, and the deputy sheriff says, "Why in the heck are we having to pay $60,000+ for this test?" Well, apparently the lab got it wrong. They did a full spectrum analysis on this blood sample instead of just the $20 test. And he's like, I don't know. They made a mistake or whatever. So the sheriff confiscated the report, but the deputy had a copy of it. And I didn't know this until recently when my other buddy, my police chief friend, we were talking. And apparently what the test came out with was unknown primate. And from a DNA test, that's the best you're going to get. I interviewed a DNA expert in Canada for my first book, and we had a long talk about DNA. I told him I don't want to talk Bigfoot for the book. I want readers to understand how DNA works. And you can't just plug anything into the system and come out with an answer. If there's nothing in the system, it'll come out to whatever is closest to it. Like people and dogs, things like that, there's tons of information on. But an unknown, system's only as good as what information has been put into it. So, but I'd say unknown primate's a pretty good result. So anyway, recently, I think it was 2 months ago, this deputy was still working for the sheriff's department. Somehow they found out he had a copy of that test. They came, confiscated the test, and fired him. And apparently no reason given.
Oh, geez.
So, and as far as other people in the government, I've had, lots of military, lots of people that have contacted me. We talked a little bit about, Moneymaker and the BFRO before we started.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think he must have been some kind of a foreign service officer because I don't hear from him about every 6 months. So one time he contacted me and he was very cryptic about anything he said or did, even his name and everything was very cryptic. But he asked me one time, he says, well, we were emailing back and forth about that show. And he posed to me a question. He said, if you were working for the government and it was your task to keep the subject of Bigfoot where it is, in other words, on the edge of believability, right? How would you do it? He says, take a couple weeks, get back to me, let me know what your thoughts are. So I thought about it, very seriously. I put myself in that position, and I thought, okay, unlike what they did with UFOs way back, you know, with this subject, it's so widespread. You'd need massive manpower to go out and find out where the creatures are, right?
Yeah.
So the best way to do it is to bring people to you. Okay, so that's the first part. It's a two-part operation. The second part is now these things they fall into patterns. Something Renee Dehinden told me many years ago. He says, these things are not spread out evenly everywhere. They were in certain places, and we know where those places are, but their patterns can be disrupted very easily. Usually, some kind of human activity, and they'll leave. Like the thing in Yakult. There was an idiot PhD primatologist that came in there and did everything that I was taught in my anthropology courses not to do when you're observing primates in the wild. And it totally disrupted their pattern. They got so angry, the creatures did, they went to the neighboring farm and tore up the garden, and the family abandoned the farm permanently. So they can be very touchy when it comes to that. So I thought, okay, if you need to find out where the creatures are currently, and that's the town hall portion. And then you need to get a bunch of dummies to go out and do stupid things like disco lights and banging on drums or whatever, and you disrupt the pattern, right? Yeah. So the few good witnesses that came forward, locals will say, they probably made it up, seeing things. And I told him that. I wrote it all out, and he says, you're not just close. He says, you hit it exactly on the head. That's exactly why they created that show. It's so people come forward where things are currently happening, and then this
give up locations.
Yeah, you need to know what's currently happening, and then these guys will go. I also know somebody who's another veteran who's on. He's not on the team anymore, but they have. I have to be careful what I say because I don't want to get him into trouble. But they have kill teams for the bad ones. Mm-hmm. Now, there's two things. There's kind of two types of behaviors. They're the creatures that are relatively benign, but they're the ones that will stay the farthest away from people. You won't see them. So that means, unfortunately, the ones you're seeing are not such nice guys. So he said, he's told me on and off over the last couple of years how hard it is to kill one. Where these people think they're just going to go out and shoot one and that's going to be that. It's much more difficult than that. He says the best usually they can do is break up their patterns, scatter them and try to get them to leave because they'll fixate in people. In fact, I know two cases right now just off the top of my head. One is the anthropologist I have on my show. She's got them around her property and they've been changing their tactics. In fact, she's had 18-inch tracks come right to her house. We set up a boundary for you can set up, and this is through another source in the government, that if you have a combination of bleach and lemon juice, if they're coming into your property, you need to establish a boundary using scent. So you spray that mixture around, and that they don't like it at first, but that sets up a boundary, and because scent, the strongest thing in nature, is the top dog. So. And that one has worked every time I've told people who are in bad situations to use that. And that's all the way from here to Australia. It's worked.
Lemon scent, lemon and bleach, you said?
Bleach, the combination of bleach and lemon juice, yeah.
Wow.
So if you got somebody that's having problems there, tell them to do that. And generally that works. So I won't even go into what the guy in the kill team has told me. Geez.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
The guy on the kill team, has he ever told you approximately how many they've killed?
Not the numbers.
Or states that they did.
Well, not really. I know where he was working in Oregon. And then of course he told me what one of their procedures was when they cut them open to see what they've been eating, and they have to weigh and measure them. They found partial remains of a man in one. And he was so distraught over that situation. He's a pretty tough guy. He was really worked up over that situation. That's why he texted me, because the guys in the team weren't allowed to talk to each other about it. So he reached out to me, because I'll keep people confidential. And, I don't believe anybody should go. There's too many people that want to looky-loos. They want to just go disrupt somebody's life, and I just don't believe that.
Right.
But I've heard through all these different sources so many things over the last few years that's really dramatically changed my outlook and how I approach going to the field and everything. In fact, I don't go anywhere alone out in the wilderness anymore. That's the first thing I tell people: never go alone. Don't be out there at night. A lot of these wannabe researchers want to go out at night. That's when they're feeding. Don't mess with them when they're feeding. Because we're not above being on the menu. So, and if you want to observe something that's going on, that'll disrupt a pattern. And so when I take my team to the field, we'll usually about an hour before sunset and sunrise, or an hour before sunset and an hour after sunrise during the day, you can be in their areas. It's okay, because they're not there. But at night, we leave them alone.
Where's that boundary? There's got to be a fine line of wanting and trying to observe them without disrupting their pattern. What's that boundary? I mean, because I am that guy that goes out at nighttime alone, because I'm terrified doing it. Not gonna lie.
I would be terrified.
Not
if
gonna lie.
If you knew the things I knew, you'd be terrified.
But for me, it's at nighttime. In the daytime in Florida, some of these woods can be really, really tricky to see in, and it's probably like that in Washington and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And at nighttime, I feel like having a thermal is our best option, but mostly in the cooler months, because in the summer months, these trees and palmettos hold on to the heat all but like 2 hours of the night. They're holding on. The forest is glowing through a thermal.
Some of these people out there, they go and buy or get these really expensive thermal cameras. You don't need that. I found, and I did it just because I was being cheap. One of the things when I take a team in the field, this has been this way since we were kids, teenagers, as I was, and it served me the same way in the Army, because, being a sergeant, you're always worried about your people. I wanted to keep my teams head together. And when we were in the Three Sisters Wilderness, I had a couple of guys, like I said, they're all new, all of us working together, who were pretty jumpy after dark. So I thought, okay, I'm going to find, what I ended up finding was a thermal the size of a cell phone. And it's the ones that contractors use to find things in buildings and stuff, right?
Yeah.
But I thought
hot spots through the walls.
Yeah, exactly. So what I did, I thought, you know what, let me get this. It's only $150. I'll take it outside and see how far it works. And I'll be doggoned if it worked great. You could get a couple 100 yards visibility, and in the woods, usually you don't have that much ahead of you anyway.
Yeah.
So it was a great tool to let me know what was around us. And it also showed, rocks holding temperature and things like that, but they're different. And I bought another one since then that actually will record video. And you can change the settings on it for temperature and on all that kind of stuff. So it's a much less expensive way to do this without trying to look big and important and having these big clunky recorders. It's really not necessary to have all that. You can have this little thing the size of a cell phone. You shove it in your pocket and then you push one button. It's on right now and it's good to go. That to me, that's a great way to go to the field. I always try to, use the old KISS method we said in the Army: keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah.
And the same thing with recorders. Somebody told me to get a Zoom recorder. Zoom recorders are excellent in terms of quality and what they'll do. It's simple to use.
These H1N1s.
Yeah, there you go. So I bought a really spiffy pair of binoculars that I hardly ever use. We got a drone that we're playing with, We haven't used that a bunch yet, but now I'm seeing that we do need it, for areas we can't get to. But I'm trying to think. There's other things. I mean, it's working smarter, not harder, is what it
Yeah.
boils down to.
Yeah. I just put it out there that for me, going out at nighttime, I feel like I'm going to have a better opportunity to see them peeking around trees than I would daytime because of the shadows and the movement of the clouds and the trees and all the play with the diffusion inside the canopy and whatnot.
Mhm.
And you don't get shadows moving on FLIR,
Just be
on
careful
thermal.
because it only takes one bad one,
Right.
and we've been in areas. The Three Sisters Wilderness. In fact, I'll tell you that area is it's Lane County, Oregon, east of Eugene. And when we were there in 2023, 156 people vanished up there that year alone. We were there in July. The month of August, after we left, 11 people that month alone vanished. And it's not the kind of place you can get lost in very easy. So, and the locals, the town we stayed at has 3 whole buildings that constitute the town. A very, very remote area. And once people there knew what we were doing, they'd come up to us and they'd whisper things like, I mean, I don't know how many times I heard people say, do you guys know how many people are missing up here? They were scared and they knew what was taking the people. There was one day a guy, one of the locals, pulled out to his driveway, and on the highway, there's one highway that goes through the whole valley along the Mackenzie River. And he got out to get his mail out of the mailbox, and he disappeared right there in the middle of the day. And he wasn't the kind of guy that would walk away or anything, and locals all knew. We found where an Angus cow had been hauled 5 miles up into the mountains. What we found was, the hair from the hide and a few of the bones, but the locals were down at the base of the hill where these Angus herds were. These things would come in there and pushed over big dumpsters and done all kinds of things. They'd seen them and heard them, and they had no doubt that, one of these things took this Angus cow and more of them. There were more animals missing.
Yeah, we there's a place that we research with another researcher here in Florida. All the places that I research are were shown to us by another researcher here in Central South Florida. And one of the places kind of over towards Okeechobee, Lake Okeechobee, Alapatha, there's a actual trail for just bystanders to go walk on the trail or whatnot. But what doesn't make any sense is they got free range roaming cattle in this trail, which is dangerous as all get out. But back there where there has been reports of Sasquatch and sightings and noises and stuff, there's a spot back there where 3 or 4 cattle, we call it the boneyard, 3 or 4 cattle been brought to one spot, and they're just bones strung all over the place.
Back in 1980, when I was stationed at Fort Lewis, I was at my parents' house, and we had a family friend who sort of lived off the grid his whole life. I think he only had 2 jobs in his entire life because he lived off the forest. So, he taught me how to fish and stuff like that when I was a kid, so I knew him really well. So he made the effort to drive, which was a big thing for him, to find a payphone to call my parents' house. And like I said, I just happened to be there. So he said, you need to come up here right away. And I knew if he said that, it was important. So I got in my truck and I drove up there where he lived. And he says, I got something that's kind of funny to tell you. He says, I got a visit from the game department today. And it was one of the officials from the game department. And he asked him, he says, well, have you been hearing any strange screams up here lately? And of course, that triggered his, because he knew what I did as a hobby when I had a chance to. So he already knew what the guy was talking about. So he played dumb and said no. And it was funny. This guy, Charlie, our family friend, he was something of a genius, actually. It's too bad that he lived the way he did because he was a really smart guy. He'd figured out how to draw power because he had a cabin up there. He figured out how to draw power off the power lines undetected. So they didn't know where it was being drained off. But somehow the game department figured it out, but they never said anything. And they said, well, I got something to show you. And he showed him this report that was written up. And apparently some mushroom pickers earlier that day had found right up above on the mountain above his house. And the report was the worded exactly. He said, 2 elk were found dismembered without the use of tools. And I knew where the herd elk hung out. We did for years. It was a place called the Alder Flats, and there was a big herd of elk that lived there all the time. And these 2 elk had been taken apart without tools. So, and he told Charlie, he says, well, if you hear anything, you let me know, or Puget Power is going to find out where their electricity is going. So I drove up the hill, and I had a 357 that I had at the time. And I drove up there that night, and I found the place where the elk were torn apart. There was blood up there, and there were 15-inch Sasquatch tracks all over the place. And I took some pictures and speaking of the original pioneers, everything that I collected in my early years, I sent to John Green, because Green seemed to me, now Renee, he was the field guy, but Green was the guy that seemed like he was actually compiling information. So I sent him pictures, and he said, yeah, those are pretty good tracks. And that's all I ever heard. There was a time when I was still in high school, my senior year, that we, in fact, it was right after I met those guys. Green had given my phone number to a college student in Portland, Oregon, who called me, and he said he was writing a paper on Bigfoot and wanted to talk to eyewitnesses. So I told him what I'd seen. Then afterwards, he says, do you know about the incident that happened in Mount St. Helens in 1924? And I said, yeah, I read about it in Green's book. He says, have you ever been there? And I said, well, not on the east side of the mountain. My dad and uncle, we've hunted on the west side, but I've never been on the other side of the mountain. He says, well, you really ought to go there. He says, it's a cool place. So he gave me information on how to find where the cabin had existed. And so me and 6 or 5 of my buddies, we took a trip down there, and I wrote about that in my second book, because it was pretty funny most of the trip. But again, the first night down there, we found a long line of footprints, and they were probably, it had to be an 18-inch. I think at the time we said 19, but considering slippage in the pumice, but we could see this line of tracks going for a good mile up the ridge in the moonlight. So we took pictures of those. I sent the pictures to Green. All Green responded back was, did you use a flash? And Green was like that. I mean, he was just he was not really involved in the subject that much, and probably in the early days. Well, in the early days, those guys, their whole mission, they weren't out to prove the things are real. They were out to get the scientists involved, and then they were going to go away. They didn't want to be part of it. So, and that's where a lot of these so-called conferences come from today, because they did a couple of those back in the 70s, and they kind of fizzled out because scientists weren't interested. And people say people like Grover Krantz. Well, Krantz, yeah, I'll tell you, it was funny. Those guys, the way they interacted with each other was hilarious. Renee DeHinden and Grover Krantz couldn't stand each other. And Renee loved to get him wound up. So, and Renee used to, when I was living in Vancouver, Renee used to save up his money all year long, and he'd make 1-2-week trip to Bluff Creek every year. So on his way back, he would always stop at my house and visit for a couple of days. So, and he would always call me ahead of time and say, hey, I'm going to be at your house tomorrow or the next day. So on this time he called, and I had gotten in an argument with Krantz on the phone. We had kind of a knockdown, drag out argument, and I was pissed. So Renee calls me, and I said, that goddamn Krantz. And that perked his ears and prices. Well, what happened? No, never mind. I'll be there later. We'll talk about it. So I'm telling him about this argument. And he says, boy, that goddamn Krantz. They were having some conference in Eastern Washington at the time. He says, I wasn't going to go to that, but you know what? I think I'm going to go there and just get in that Krantz's backside, So he went over there, and Renee calls me about 2 weeks later, just chuckling. And he says, boy, I really gave it to that guy. He said he quit talking after I got on him, and it was just hilarious, the way they do that.
Just get under each other's skin on purpose.
Renee would, he didn't like Bob Titmus. He called him that little titmouse, and I don't know what their issue. Oh, he had a story. There was a while when Green and Titmus, and it's funny because Titmus didn't like Green either, but even though they kind of hung out together, he groused to me about Green screwing him on a house that he sold. I'll tell you, Renee DeHinden, we used to joke about him being like the CIA. We called him the DIA. Because if you want to know about anything or any situation, you just call Renee and say, "Hey, Renee, do you know so-and-so?" And he'd either tell you on the spot, I mean, in minute detail about that person, or he'd say, "Give me a couple days, I'll call you back." So I learned a lot from that guy. In fact, I even have dirt on Renee. And this is a good one. I've told other people before plenty of times, and even on my own show. Everybody thinks the original Patterson film vanished. The one that Patterson had in the camera that day.
Yeah.
Well, it didn't. I was at Renee's house one year in the 80s. We were sitting around drinking a beer, shooting the breeze, and I was asking some questions about something with the film. So he opens his safe and he says, "Well, I have the film right here." And he had Patterson that day cast 3 of the footprints. One of them broke, so he had a left and a right. The left and right cast were sitting there in Renee's safe with the film. I didn't think anything of it, until I talked to Mrs. Patterson a few years later, and she was like a female version of Renee DeHinden. And she was great. She was hilarious. She told me this story about how Renee, when Patterson was still alive, him and Patterson were business partners until Patterson died in 1972. So Patterson gave him 60% of the rights of the still photos from the film. So Renee, anytime, back in the 60s and 70s, if you saw a picture from Patterson's film in a magazine, Renee had sold that to whoever for about $600. That's what he got. When Mrs. Patterson let somebody use the film, she was get $2,500. So financially, and Renee, everybody, these people have these conspiracy theories about Renee that he worked for the Canadian government. All that. He didn't have a pot to piss in. He really didn't. He lived at the Vancouver Gun Club doing chores around there in an old beat up trailer he had. Well, he had 2 old beat up trailers. Then he had a contractor's office. That's what he lived in. And the 2 trailers were cobbled together and they had all these books and just all this stuff. So Renee didn't have any money. So he would badger. He ended up getting 100% of the rights to the still photos. And then he was badgering Mrs. Patterson constantly for the rights to the film footage. And she kept saying no. So one time he was coming back from California and he called her again. And she says, "Well, okay, we'll meet my attorney's office in Yakima, whatever day they arranged and time. And I'll meet you there and we'll all talk." So when she goes to this arranged meeting, now the original film and these 2 footprint casts were sitting on the attorney's desk, and they were gone. And I think the attorney's office had been left open or whatever, so nobody saw him do it, but they just vanished. That's where this thing came up about the film disappearing.
Yeah.
Well, after she told me that, I knew who did it. I knew Renee took him.
Yeah.
And of course, he was nowhere to be seen. He didn't show up for the meeting. He even lent me the cast. I made molds from him. So I knew he had all this stuff.
Yeah.
So I even had dirt on Renee. And of course, after he died, nobody wanted anything that he had. So, all that stuff probably got thrown away, or, even his ashes when he was cremated, they left him on the floorboard of his truck for weeks until somebody went to clean it out. He just kind of, Renee was the kind of a guy, he insisted that everything be 100% above board and credible. But unfortunately, him and Green and those guys, they were kind of, I don't know how you say it. They were kind of had a fixed thinking about this stuff. My focus was always on behavior. Those 2 guys would never thought about that and weren't interested. So when I would bring up questions, I would kind of get politely brushed off to the side, and then we'd go on to talk about something else. But, without those guys, nobody would be involved in this. They just wouldn't be, and that's, I remember the original story Renee told me, and I've read it elsewhere also, where When he immigrated to Canada, he was on the eastern part of Canada, and he worked for a farmer, and they were having lunch, I think it was, and they had this news flash that came on the radio about some British guys, mountaineers, going to go look for the Yeti in the Himalayas. And Rene made the comment. He says, "Wow, wouldn't it be exciting to go do that?" And the farmer was very nonchalant. He says, "Well, you don't have to go that far. They have these things out in British Columbia." So the year later, Rene packs up and he goes to British Columbia. And he went around looking at libraries and asking locals and everything. And he made the determination that there was enough information, enough solid information to warrant seriously looking into the subject, because he was kind of on the fence to begin with. And then they had a centennial in British Columbia, and John Green was the editor of a paper in a little town of Harrison Hot Springs. And they got, and I can't remember what year it was. I think it was late 50s, I think. And they got $500 to do something for the centennial. And Rene, and I think it was in the paper that they had this, and they didn't really know what they were going to do. So Rene barges in. Him and Green both laughed and told me the story independently of each other about how Rene came in and literally pounded his fist on Green's desk and said, "What are you going to do about this? There needs to be a serious investigation." So somehow he convinced Green, not so much for that, but to look into some of these cases, and that's where you see some of these things in Green's book. And then around the same time, things were happening in Northern California. So they got linked up with stuff there, and of course, the rest is history.
What was their take on Patterson and Roger Patterson and Bob Kimling?
Well, Green, they knew Patterson pretty well. In fact, Green showed me his files, and he had about 1,500 reports in his file cabinet. And he says, well, a lot of people, they had questions about Patterson having the same stories in his book that Green had in his first book that was published 2 years later. Patterson 66, Green's in 68. He says, well, I've known Roger for a while, so I let Roger go through my files and use what he wanted to. So that's why there were similar stories. But people like Al Hodgson. Now, Al Hodgson in the town of Willow Creek, that's really the nearest. Well, it's not really the nearest. It's the nearest, I should say, bigger town. And that's kind of stretching it because Willow Creek's a very small place, but all that area is very remote. So it's about 45 minutes from the mouth of Bluff Creek. And the film site's another 7 miles up the creek from there. But so anyway, they afterwards, they didn't think anything about. I mean, of course, they were all excited about the film and all that, but Rene told me that he says, I spent 20 years trying to prove that film was a fake, and I couldn't do it. And if anybody could have done it, that man would have done it, because he was really, really skeptical about everything. And he said, you kind of have to be. I mean, I'm the same way, even though I know what I've seen. I know the creatures are out there, but when somebody brings, and I get people send me stuff all the time, and most of the time I won't hurt their feelings because, they mean well.
Yes.
And I don't know for 100% sure what they've showed me isn't evidence of the creatures. A lot of times it's things that's not very good, but you have to be very critical of evidence. I'll give you, here's a good example. For the longest time, when we talk about structures, I've been all over the West Coast for many years, thousands of hours out in the forest, have never once seen anything I would consider a structure.
Really?
But when we were on the Navajo reservation, and those people are very forthright. I mean, they'll tell you straightforward what's on their mind. They aren't going to make a bunch of stuff up. So they were people were out picking pinyon nuts, and they could sell those to make extra money. So we would stop and talk to everybody we saw, and there was this one family. We told Don, our Navajo guy, that if we went back down to the road, and they told us how to find this little spur road, and it's pretty heavily timbered area of the reservation. These little spur roads are almost never used, so there's not really much of a road. So I pulled my Jeep. We found the road they told us to find, pulled the Jeep off, and we decided to walk down this road. And they said about a quarter of a mile down there. Now, what they had found They had seen two structures, a big one and a small one. And in the small one, there was an infant Sasquatch lying in it. And it was being very quiet, very still, but its eyes were open. And them and their kids, everybody walked up and was looking down at this thing, and then they saw Mama not too far away. So they all got scared and took off. So we went down and he said, it's about a quarter of a mile down into that road. So my buddy Adam and I, we walked down there, and Don went back a different direction, and we didn't see anything. So I said, well, let's keep going because people's estimate of distance is all different, So we walked about a mile down that little road. And finally, to the left, we did find a very rudimentary structure, a little better than a lean-to, really. And there was the beginnings of a larger one. So when we talked to the family, they said, well, the ones that we found, the original ones, had been destroyed, taken apart. And what we found was the remnants of another one. And I got thinking about what some of the others had told us about that place in that very area. They told about this white Sasquatch that lived in the area year round. Apparently it was an older one, and tons of wild horses out there. And they said it eats horses. So we did find another one, very strange situation. We drove, there's only one road going into that area, and we'd driven it a number of times going in. And one day there was the carcass, the articulated carcass, bones, just bones of this horse. The whole animal was there. It had been carried and placed near the road. And I'm thinking, I've never seen anything like that.
Yeah.
And then in the trees, we did find two other ones, at least two other, but the bones were all separated. Interestingly enough, though, porcupines and other small animals will gnaw on bones. Yeah. There was no gnaw marks on any of those bones whatsoever. And I found that very odd. I can't say for sure why not, but very odd. Not far from that area, we found, and in this part of the country, you look at the deer horns and you count them just on one side. A lot of parts of the country, they'll count the antlers on both sides, but here it's just one side. So there were 4 antlers on each side, and between 6 and 7 feet off the ground inside the tree line, these antlers were jammed into this tree trunk. And Don told us about how Navajo culture treats animals that are killed, and it's never ever like that. It's always, if they get to take a skull and they'll put it on a fence post and display it prominently in front of their house, and
respectfully,
very respectfully, yeah. So, and this was something I have a lot of pictures of from different parts of the country where these deer are hung up in trees. And my thinking is it's probably baiting, because these guys are ambush predators. They're going to get their meals the easiest way they can. And it's a mathematical, survival's mathematical. You need more calories coming in than you are expending them. So you're that big, you need to conserve energy. The best way to do it is to ambush.
Yeah.
In an area adjacent to Bluff Creek, we found where they were using their feces to drive game animals into a choke point. We found in a 35 square mile area this one trip. Now the feces were anywhere from 30 days to a few hours old, but we found 50 piles of it in a single day, just going through this area. And we hiked down to a creek in this little narrow valley, and there wasn't any down there. And I thought to myself, now that's odd. How come they're everywhere we've seen? You can't go more than 100 feet down one of the logging roads without finding some. And these were enormous piles of crap, but nothing down here. Then I got thinking to myself, well, if you're this big, but you need to save energy, how are you gonna eat enough during a day? You're not just gonna go running around the brush trying to run down deer.
Yeah.
Because you might not get anything. And usually with predatory animals, they're not very successful mostly often. So you're going to be like a big cat. And then I realized I was on a game trail next to this tree line. So I started looking inside the tree line, and about 20 feet inside the tree line, here's all this poop, because they've been pooping like crazy up everywhere else. And I thought, well, they're not just going to stop that to come down here. And sure enough, they were hiding it in there. They were using it up in these higher areas to drive the game animals down here, and then they were going to ambush them. So I've been looking at things with that lens since then, and it's panned out most often.
Yeah.
In Oregon, we found a manufactured kill zone. Actually, we didn't find it. One of the locals found it and took us to it. And it was about a year old, so the trees were pretty weathered at that point, but it was pretty obvious what they were doing there. My contact down there now found another thing that was really bizarre. And it's not, like I said, it's not like these ornate things you see everywhere else on YouTube or wherever. These are very rudimentary kind of things, but you can see what the purpose is in what they're doing. And then back in the going back to the 80s at Bob Titmus's house one time, he was taking me around showing me some things. And I noticed that he had all these little sticks. And they were, maybe that big around and maybe a foot long, and they were snapped over. And he had piles of them all over the floor. And I said, Bob, what are those? He says, well, me and so-and-so, we were down in Bluff Creek one year, and we were following this 15-inch line of tracks. And periodically we'd see these. And he says, well, I think they're just walking along and grab them and they snap them and flip them over or whatever. So, but I brought them back just in case. I wasn't very impressed by it because it didn't, I thought, yeah, maybe, whatever, right? So I kept it in the back of my mind. Then there was a story and Green published it from Sports Afield magazine from 1963. Long Hunter Alaskan Style was the name of the article. And it was about a couple of guys who were trapping in Alaska, and a group of Dena Indians approached them. And they said, the creature Gilliuk is here. It's what they called it. And they said, we're hunting caribou. Gilliuk doesn't eat caribou. It eats men. So they said, usually it doesn't bother white people. So we want you to camp with us. Maybe it'll leave us alone. So they planned on doing it the next day. But by the time the two white trappers went there, the chief had been taken and apparently eaten. So that was the end of that story. But they talked about, they said, we can prove it to you, Gilliuk's marks. They took him to this birch sapling, and they said it was twisted like a matchstick. So I had to think about that. I remember my dad, he was 40 years older than me. And, my parents, they went through the Depression and World War II and everything. So I had to think about and this story would have happened probably around 1940 or so. So I thought, what did they say? Because my parents would use terminology that we might think is literal, but they would use it meaning something else, like twisting. So I thought to myself, well, shoot, twisting would be like this. They would call that a twist, or we'd say it's a break.
Right.
So fast forward to 1991. With this information kind of tucked away in the back of my mind, one of my buddies and I had been trying to get into this river watershed for like 5 different times, and it was really difficult to get in there. So we ended up having to wade the river up our chests to get across into there. Didn't see anything up there, so we decided to climb the ridge. And on the top of this ridge that divided 2 drainage systems, there were a lot of sightings on both sides. So we figured the saddle had to be a natural crossing point. So we wanted to see the saddle. So we climbed up I looked at my map, it was about 2,200 feet in elevation where we were, inside a closed canopy. And where we stopped for a break, I happened to notice this Doug fir sapling, probably 15 feet tall, about 3 inches in diameter. And I had a tape measure on me. So I measured, this thing was snapped 90 degrees over. And this is the middle of July, no bad weather, especially inside a closed canopy. And I thought, well, for God's sake, what did that? That's not, and I examined it pretty closely. It was 8 feet, 1 inches off the ground where the break happened. There's no claw marks, no bear of any kind. There was no marks on the trunk whatsoever. So we got looking around, and off to the northeast, we saw just at the edge of our vision, there was another one. We ended up following, every time we get to one, we'd see another one. We found 13 of these before I said, we better get back. We're going to run out of daylight. We still got to cross that river up to our chest, right? And I don't want to try doing that in the dark. So I showed my buddy that was a Klamath Indian, and he chuckled. And I said, what are you laughing about? He says, oh, you finally found that. I said, hello, do you want to tell me what that is? And he says, yeah. He says, that's their mark. He says, that's how he says, what you found is the big guy of the group telling the rest of them, where we're going to the next feeding area. But he says typically these snap trees are where, when they're currently in an area, that's where they are. And sure enough, when we did the work in Oregon, that's what we found. We were in one place, we found some of these trees and some other evidence. And I told the guys we were going to go 30 miles to a Boy Scout camp through the forest. And I said, don't say anything, but along the way, count how many trees you see like this along the way. So we get to the Boy Scout camp, and I asked everybody, how many did you count? Not a one. I said, so here's the lesson. What you don't see is as important as what you do see sometimes. This mark is what Indians told me they do. We found it where there was activity, but nowhere else. And then sure enough, at the Boy Scout camp or near there, we did find an older one there. So it's only places we found where there's activity. That's where we see these. And I always look at the fresh ones. I don't look at the old ones because, they're probably not there anymore. But for whatever reason, they seem to do it where they currently are.
Can you touch base on the manufactured kill zone?
Yeah, that was bizarre.
What
I'd
it
never
looked
really
like.
seen anything like that. There was a group of these small trees near a game trail, and what they had done was they snapped them over a bunch of these, in this one spot where it covered the trail, to where any deer coming down the trail would stop and try to figure out a different way around it. And then I'm sure they were nearby and just would grab the deer.
Yeah. Bob, you probably do you think you know where I'm going with what I'm about to say?
Yep.
I'm not sure. Ask away.
Well, for us, we found a place in the Ocala National Forest. We found a hot spot, and we casted 17-inch three-toed prints.
Mhm.
That look like this.
Oh, now that might be something entirely different.
Right. So, but when we got to this place, what made us stop and look is it was just off of a trail. We were on Bobby's side-by-side Kubota, and it looked like two big transformer robots, Bobby describes it, had this big fight in the woods. There's just trees just broke down and laid all over the damn place. And in that, and there's the breaks are 3 to 4 feet off the ground. And trees that were, on average that big around or bigger,
right,
broke. And in that area with all these broken trees was quite a bit of hog activity too. And we found an X, and we actually tracked these prints tight roped up to an X. The X was like this. It walked up to the right side of the X. It pivoted to the left and went around it.
Were those near a marshy area by chance?
No, it was very dry in Ocala where we were at that time. But at first I was thinking maybe the X means, it's redundant for the people that have seen our show. I always thought X might be keep out, but you would never put keep out on your front porch. You'd put it on your property line.
To be honest with you, I've never seen an X anywhere.
Yeah, we see them down here. But then I started looking at all these trees that are laid down in such a way with all this hog activity, and outside of this destruction, there wasn't nowhere near the hog activity. Nowhere near. You get outside of this destruction, and it wasn't like this. And so it got me thinking that maybe that this was a hunting area, a manufactured hunting zone, because at night all the trees look the same. Every tree looks the same at nighttime. Right. And if you're trying to drive prey to a specific tree, it can. But at nighttime, if you can see in the dark, this looks different than all of the trees straight up and down.
Sure.
And so my theory for it was they ripped and tore up all these trees to slow down the hogs in this area.
That would do it.
Because again, these three-toed prints were also about 1.5 to 1.75 inches in compressed into the ground,
Mhm.
and we couldn't even drive our finger that
Right.
far into it. We couldn't stomp an impression. So these things were carrying some weight. And so that's why I was asking about your manufactured kill zone. Because that's what this to me seemed like, all this debris laying down, very hard to maneuver around where all the hog activity is. And outside of it, there's not that hog activity where they're just, and it kind of seemed like that X meant something too, because it's breaking trees off everywhere it goes, but it walked right up to that X, pivoted to the left, went around it and disappeared. Have you come across things like that other than the X? I mean, so like manufactured with trees and stuff to slow down prey.
Well,
Have
this
the Native
particular one,
Americans that you've talked to said anything about that?
oh yeah, this particular one definitely, that's definitely what that was. Typically what they'll do, like other primates, so they'll hunt in groups. So if they're chasing game, they'll run them into a kill zone. There's a video I saw of chimps hunting a smaller monkey, and it wasn't all that different than what we did in the army. If you're going to run an enemy into a kill zone, they had the outliers and they had the chase. Sometimes when you hear people talking about they know they're being followed, but they also hear something on their left and right, it's almost like cats playing. They're playing. That's how they learn how to hunt. And I think a lot of times these things will do that. They consider us very dangerous. These things do. So, it might be a thing to practice on the humans, doing that kind of a thing where they'll hear their noisier behind them, but they'll also hear noises on the left and right.
Potentially teaching the juveniles how to
Teaching them how to hunt. Sure.
Yeah.
I know.
So we're bait. So we're bait.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes. Sure. Sure.
Well, I feel like I could sit here and listen to another 3 hours with you.
I've talked 8-9 hours with people.
No, seriously, I feel like we haven't even touched the surface. I know you said you were very busy, Will, but we would love to have you back to delve into some other things. But before we get out of here, you've wrote some books, and I'd like to touch on that so people can be aware of what you've put out and potentially maybe learn some stuff, that you've published.
Well, it's probably easier to go to my website, williamjevning.com. And I know there's a link to the books there. I can't even remember offhand what all my titles are. But that's probably the easiest one. Just go to my website and then click on the link to the books there.
Gotcha. Do you have a favorite?
The last one I did, and this is funny, years ago, I had an idea for a field guide. This was back in the 90s. And I'll be doggone if somebody, I don't know how they did it, they stole my idea. Because Renee and I were good friends. I had access to the still photos for the Patterson film, right? The cover was just going to be a small one, maybe 20 pages. And the cover was going to be the famous photo where the creature's turning and looking at Patterson, right?
Yeah.
But whoever copied my idea, they did a drawing of that because they didn't have permission to use the photograph. And it was just filled with crap. So I was ticked, and I just didn't want to do it anymore. But a friend of mine recently, he says, no, you need to put a field guide out. So it's called Bigfoot Survival Guide.
I feel like Dr. Jeff Meldrum put out a field guide.
He did, but his is crap.
Okay.
I'll tell you stories about Meldrum sometime. He's kind of my chew toy. So.
Well, we had him on here. He was great to us.
He wants to come on my show, but I just haven't gotten around to deciding if I want to ask him or not.
Yeah. I was able to ask him a question that irritated me a lot, and he answered it. And he,
what question was it?
He was taken back by the question because many, many times I've seen him on TV.
Mm-hmm.
He examines he's got hundreds of casts.
He got all those from Krantz.
Right. And he examines these things, and he's in the Bigfoot community, but he would end whatever documentary or show he was on by saying, if these creatures exist, and it drove me bananas.
He's never seen one.
He has. He actually has.
Well, he claims.
He was with
it's probably because I was on his butt so much about that exact thing.
Well, he was with
Todd Standing.
And not
Fraud Standing.
Oh gosh, what's the other scientist who passed away? Sweet old man.
Bindernagel.
Yeah, he was also with John Bindernagel as well when they had their sighting. So John was there when they had it. And I asked him, I'm like, it kind of seems like a disservice when you say if they exist. You've got all these casts, but then you leave it open to they don't exist, And he was like, I that's interesting. I never thought of anybody taking that view on the way I say it. And he's like, I'll say it like this. When, as a scientist, you're supposed to approach things, you're supposed to approach them with questions. And that's why I would say if this would exist, if these creatures exist, blah, 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 blah. And it made sense at the time. But for me, it was like, you're just doing a disservice every time you say if they exist. But
exactly. He's trying to ride both sides of the fence.
But he on our show.
He openly said, no, I believe they're real. I know they're real.
Yeah.
I didn't know who he was when I published my first book. And he sends me this email and he says, well, I'm doing a scientific online review. I'd like to have a copy of your book. So I emailed it back and I said, sure, you're more than welcome to have a copy. There's nothing scientific about it, but you're more than welcome to have one. And he's like, no, I'd like to have one. So I mailed him one. About 2 weeks later, I get a scathing email from this guy. Now, I don't know him from Adam, right? And I went out of my way to mail him a copy of my book. So, being a former drill sergeant, I can go from 0 to S, in like 2.3 seconds. And as the older I get, I'm mellower. So I thought, I want to find out what his modus operandi is here. What's he so wound out about? So I got it out of him. And of course, my training is in psychology too. So I got it out of him that there were two main points that he had issues with. The first one was that I didn't mention his name anywhere in my book. Well, I didn't know him from Adam. Why am I going to put him in my book when I don't know who he is?
Yeah.
Secondly was I had a friend who was, and he's gone now, but he used to write for the Skeptical Inquirer magazine. And he and I used to get in these long conversations on the phone. And he'd stop me an hour into a conversation. He'd say, damn it, Will, we're supposed to be on opposite side of the fence. How can we agree on everything? I said, it's because I'm as big a skeptic as you are. Even though I know they're out there, I still approach everything with a question. It's like Renee always said, everybody has a right to their opinion, but nobody has a right to be wrong about the facts. And without the facts, your opinion means nothing. So that's always been my thinking. So I
like that.
He wouldn't give me permission. Thinking. Yeah, it's great. It really is. It's applicable.
Can you say that one more time?
Yeah, he said that everyone has a right to their opinion, but no one has a right to be wrong about the facts. And without the facts, your opinion means nothing.
I like
so he wouldn't let me use the whole article. It was like an 82-page article. What it was, the article was about a set of tracks that Paul Freeman supposedly found back in 82. So the Forest Service hired 2 professional tracking companies, and Bob Titmus went there. And they went through this line of tracks, and they determined they were hoaxed. Now, Freeman was an admitted hoaxer, but these tracks, and they listed all the reasons why they were determined fake. Very good reasons. So I put that in my book because I wanted readers to understand the difference between real and fake, tracks and sightings, things like that. I want to give people kind of a good middle ground to look at things from. I want people to think. That's my goal, is I want people to think. So apparently that particular set of tracks is what Meldrum bases his mid-tarsal break theory on. So he wasn't too happy with me. But I told him, when in the midst of this back and forth argument, I said, you know what? I've done this a long time. I know how to find the creatures. I know where they are, and I don't need you. Boy, he backed off in a real hurry after that. Him and Todd Standing had a very short-lived podcast where they stole my. I have a company called Jevning Research and Communications. It's an actual company, and they stole my logo. And boy, I let them have it publicly about that, and they went away very quickly. So, I know everybody holds people like Meldrum in reverence, but I'm more like, and he had issues with my friendship with Renee DeHinden. That's what really got me in the email. What are you worried about my friendship with DeHinden?
Yeah.
That's irrelevant. I knew all those guys. I didn't know Peter Byrne, but I did know the rest of those guys. I did contact Byrne once, and I offered him the use of my field team, but he didn't want it.
Yeah. Well, man, that's a lot of information. I feel like we need to do this again.
We can talk again if you like. Sure.
I would absolutely love it.
Just let me know.
Sure. Do you got a couple of titles that you remember of your book that you could put out there?
Well, the first one is Tracking North America Sasquatch, Haunted Valley. Of course, I have Bigfoot Evidence, Witness of the Unknown, Volume 1 and 2. And those two books are people email instead of talking to me. So a lot of times they'll email and they'll write out what their experience was. And I published a couple volumes. Actually, I'm thinking about publishing a third volume of those. Let me think. In Search of the Unknown. Oh, I did one on the Minnesota Iceman. Bigfoot Fieldwork 101. And that's actually been very useful for people because I tell them, point blank what kind of equipment they should use and not going real expensive. If you're just going to dabble in the subject to see if you want to do it, here's the cheaper way to do it and the things you need to do. And I'll tell you, we had a gal in Central Texas about a year ago, found a hell of a set of tracks down there. Beautiful tracks, hundreds of them. And a friend of mine that's a retired colonel in the Army, he lives down in that area, and he called me and he says, well, I may need to call you, to tell me what to do. And I said, do you have a copy of my Bigfoot Fieldwork 101? He says, yeah. I said, just follow the instructions in there when it comes to measurements of footprints, and people confuse step and stride. And I tell the difference in there and how to measure both and how to cast footprints. And he did all that beautifully just by following the instructions. So, I encourage people to get that if they want to dabble in the topic. And it's not just for people new, it's for people that have been around a while. Maybe it's helpful in some things. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just, you were talking about a trackway. I just, Bobby and I, here in, we went out and went to, I had a theory about where they are going during the day. Down here in the cypress swamps. Most of these cypress swamps, you can look in the center of them, and in the center of the trees are different, and there's different foliage and stuff like that. So it's dark green in the center of these cypress swamps, which means the ground has to be elevated.
Right.
And so we got lucky because where we researched, that place, as long as I've been going, has never been dry, but it was dry earlier this year. And Bobby and I were able to track two sets of juveniles that were pretty much walking side by side for over 100 yards in this dried up marsh. And I sent you that video. That's just in Messenger. That's just what I was doing, so you could see it. It's been great. I think you probably have a whole lot of great stories from witnesses that we'd like to hear some of those. Good ones. We'd like to hear some of those.
I've got some that have made me sit with my mouth hanging open when I'm listening to the witness tell me.
Yeah.
And yeah, we'll talk about those another time because there's a couple of them that are very, very interesting. I mean, yeah.
Awesome. Well, Bob, you got anything? You got any questions,
No.
comments?
No, I'm good.
No,
I'd
yeah,
say he tells a good story, so
yeah.
you don't
Um,
leave too many details out that you got to go back and question.
yeah, it's really easy to have a good show when you've got great
Mhm.
guests. And we have one tonight. William, I want to thank you for coming and taking your time to be with us tonight. I want to thank everybody in the chat. We had some new faces in here. Glad you guys could join us. Hopefully you'll stick around for us. Next week, we're supposed to have another gentleman on who I believe was, I believe he's a tribal member of Yakima, I believe. Mel Khan, I think is his name. I'm probably butchering that. Um, but he was also, he also worked for the forestry as well. So we're planning on having him back next week. But I would like to thank everybody for coming out and spending your time with us. I know there's 1,000 other things you could be doing, and some of you chose to spend it with us. So thank you guys very much. Will, thank you very much.
Nice
Bob,
meeting you guys.
absolutely.
Yep,
If you want to, if you want to hang out for a couple minutes, William, you're more than welcome to hang out, talk after the show, or if you want to bail now, that is perfectly fine too. But I'm going to go ahead and kick it out of here. Everybody, thanks for coming out, and Miss Cashew, thanks for being our mod tonight while Miss Diane was taking a break. Everybody, have a great night. Thank you. See you next week.